L'chaim, Eden.
Good evening, good evening. How are you, my holy brothers and sisters? It's a lovely Tuesday evening. You know, as we've been teaching this class at the same time every day, the sun is getting lower and lower in the sky, so now it's almost dark already, and I always have to say my afternoon prayer before class nowadays. How are you? Where are you tuning in from? Let's light up the darkness. We've got such an interesting daf, such an interesting page today. Super colorful. Sorry it took me a little extra time to prepare it, but there's a lot of material to cover tonight, and it's all colorful. So let's see who's with us tonight. Melissa from Great Neck, Yehuda from Florence, South Carolina, James from Indianapolis, Paula from Chicago, Matt from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, Ari says shalom from Atlanta. If this is your first time tuning in, let us know so we can welcome you. Bill with us from Arkansas, Tony from Knoxville, Vaughn from Fremont. Sorry, Facebook keeps changing what happens when you hover over something. Okay, there we go. Barbara from Arkansas, Nancy from Southern Pines, North Carolina, where we can sleep with the windows open tonight. Exciting. Stephen from Oklahoma, Hannah from Mississippi, Karen from Arizona, Sherry from New Mexico, Lucy from Minneapolis, Laura from Arizona, Christine, shalom from San Jose, Rana from Pakistan, welcome Rana from Pakistan, Stephanie says shalom aleichem, Sharon from Lebanon, Anne from Merced, Paul from Minneapolis, Pauline from Arkansas, Vernice from Buffalo, Eddie from Seattle, Tomadon from Newport Beach, Ginny from Concord, New Hampshire, in the lands of Abenaki Pennacook. I don't know what that is. Isaac from LA, Leona from Southern Illinois, and Darby from Orlando. There's usually a bit of a lag on the YouTube side, so people aren't tuned in over there yet. How you doing, guys? Where are we holding? This is chapter 6 of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We're still discussing the first Mishna of this chapter 6. Generally, we're talking about the law of joining courtyards, joining private domains, so that we can carry there on Shabbos, because we're not allowed to carry in the public domain on Shabbos, nor transfer what we're carrying from the private domain to a public domain, or vice versa. Specifically now, we're talking about this idea that if two homes or more share a courtyard, this was a common sort of, real estate arrangement in ancient times, that there would be a courtyard and two or more houses sharing it. So then it was King Solomon who decreed that as the cities became more crowded, and this is private property, the courtyard definitely is private property of the two houses that are in it. But because when you leave your house, you're entering a courtyard that other people have legal rights in, it's sort of like going into a public place. And therefore, he decreed that you can't carry an object out of your house on Shabbos into the courtyard that's your courtyard, but that you share with your neighbor who also has a house in that courtyard. So the two of you have to join in an eruv by depositing each of you a little bit of food in a basket and storing that basket in one of your homes in the courtyard. And, if several courtyards open into an alleyway, a sort of private road off the main thoroughfare, then all the courtyards that join in that alley, they have to make this kind of communal understanding, this communal eruv, depositing some food in one place and making a visible marker on that alleyway so that they could carry from their courtyard into the alleyway. They won't be able to carry out into the street that the alleyway lets out onto, because that definitely is the public domain, and that far we don't go unless we establish a whole community-wide eruv, which is something else, which is not what we're talking about now. The issue here is that if you've got in the courtyard, let's say there's 6 houses in the courtyard, and 5 of them, the owners of 5 of those houses, have joined in the eruv, but the owner of the 6th house didn't. So now all these 6 people are in the communal arrangement. It's like they've all pooled their ownership rights just for the sake of Shabbos. This arrangement only has an impact on the fact of whether you can carry in Shabbos or not. This is not making any kind of legal arrangements that restrict other people's property rights in general. It's only for the purpose of establishing the eruv. But if the owner of the 6th house didn't join in the eruv, not only is he not allowed to carry from his house out into the courtyard, but none of the people in the other 5 houses can carry either. Everybody's got to be in the eruv. And as we started to discuss yesterday and the day before, well, what if there's a situation that makes it difficult for that other person to join in the communal eruv? What if he's away? What if he doesn't want to join? What if he's not Jewish? Only Jews can join in the eruv. A non-Jew isn't restricted by the laws of Shabbos, so the eruv doesn't apply to him. But if he lives in that courtyard, then as we learned, the other people who are joining in an eruv have to get a permission from the non-Jew. Essentially, he has to rent to them his rights in the courtyard for the purposes of carrying on Shabbos. Now, I checked with my good friend, Rabbi Parry. You've met him before. He substituted for me while I was away. Rabbi Parry is a Talmudic expert. And I wanted to be sure, like, when we're renting from the non-Jew, like, what does it mean? Is it a purely symbolic arrangement, or are we renting something that he then gives up? Like, does he lose some ability? And no, he doesn't lose anything by it. We're just going to make a purely legalistic arrangement. We can give him as little as a penny or even less than a penny, but something, right? So we've made an arrangement and we're technically renting his rights in the courtyard. He can still walk through the courtyard. His friends can come and go. He can come and go. He can carry, etc. He can do whatever he wants. But we have to come to this arrangement. And if he, for whatever reason, he doesn't get along with us, he doesn't trust us, he's unsure about what this whole thing is, and he says, nah, I don't want to do that, then none of us can carry in that courtyard. We have to come to some kind of agreement with the non-Jew who lives there. And this also applies to a Jew who doesn't subscribe to the laws of eruv. For example, a Sadducee who doesn't recognize the oral Torah, only recognize the written Torah. So he wouldn't subscribe to the concept of an eruv. And this person, he's a Jew, so he could relinquish his rights. He would be permitted to do that because he's a Jew. Or we could rent them, but he'd have to do something. He can't just be there, and not participate in the eruv. He will restrict the rest of us. That's generally what we're talking about. So today we're gonna talk about a particular incident that had to do with a non-Jew whose courtyard opened onto an alleyway, a mavoy, right, in Hebrew. That he shared that alleyway with several other courtyards in which Jews lived, and they had all joined in an eruv so that they could carry in their courtyards and out into the alleyway. But this non-Jew refused to relinquish his rights, or rather, he refused to rent out his rights in the alleyway. And since he wouldn't cooperate, as it were, nobody could carry in the alleyway. They could still carry in their courtyards, but they couldn't carry objects on Shabbos out of their own personal courtyards. And for example, bring some food over to their friend's house who lives in the neighboring courtyard, but you have to cross the alleyway to get there. And so they wouldn't be able to do that. And it was a huge inconvenience for them. So this person's name, the non-Jew, and we've talked about what term is being used for the Gentile. In the Mishna that we're discussing, they said a star worshiper, right? So, and this was often translated as an idolater. It might stand in for any kind of non-Jew. It might not. In the Mishnah, we're talking about star worshippers, and it means idolaters. Here in the Gemara, the term goy is used, and we should clarify what is a goy. It really only means non-Jew. There's nothing disparaging about the word goy. Sometimes we hear it, and it sounds like is that disparaging? No, it's not. A goy it's an individual who is of the nations, simply meaning he's not of the nation of Israel. He is of one of the other nations, right? So this goy, his name was Lachman bar Ristak. So Lachman bar Ristak, and he lived in a courtyard that opened onto this alleyway. And he wouldn't rent out his rights in the alleyway, his right to use the alleyway so that the Jews could form a valid eruv. So they went to Abaye, to the sage Abaye, and asked him, what should we do? He won't cooperate. We want to have an eruv. So Abaye said, okay, well, here's one thing you could do. All of you make a bitul reshus, meaning relinquish your rights. Bitul is to nullify, reshus is in the domain, right? So it's relinquish your rights in the domain as residents to one of you, right? So all the Jews who are joined in this eruv should relinquish all their rights, to do anything here, and all relinquish their rights to just one of you. Then it will be like the situation of the leniency that we learned in our Mishnah, that if two Jews share a courtyard with the non-Jew, then they need to join into an eruv together, and they need to lease those rights, even for a penny, like from the non-Jew, so that they're going to be permitted to carry in their own courtyard. So here, what he's saying is, there's a bunch of you who all live in these courtyards that open onto the alleyway, but all of you give up all your rights for the purpose of Shabbos to just one of you. So the rest of you will not be allowed to carry in that alleyway. We're talking about, right now we're talking about in the alleyway. So you're going to relinquish your rights in the alleyway. The rest of you will be able to carry in your courtyards. You won't be able to carry in the alleyway except for one of you. You're all going to relinquish your rights. All the Jews will relinquish their rights in that alleyway to carry in that alleyway to the one Jew, to one of you, right? So that one guy, he can carry in the alleyway. And what we learned in the Mishnah is if there's only one Jew sharing a place with one non-Jew, the sages didn't decree about that. The non-Jew does not restrict the Jew from carrying in his courtyard if there's only one Jew there. So Abaye's sort of solution to this problem is, okay, all of you relinquish your rights to just one of you. It'll be like only one Jew has use of this alleyway, and so he won't be restricted by the fact that there's one non-Jew who has the use of that alleyway, since we don't decree when there's only one Jew, but rather when there's multiple Jews in that situation. Because, why? And what we had that explanation. Why did the sages not decree for the case of just one Jew? Because they said that's unusual. Usually, there might be several Jews with one Jew, non-Jew living there. But, in the Holy Land, in Israel, when these laws were coming about, or in the Jewish communities in Babylonia, it's like the Jews lived together and there weren't so many non-Jews living in their courtyards with them or even sharing these alleyways. So it will work, right? It's an uncommon situation. The sages didn't decree about that. So this should be a solution to your problems. But then the people who came to Abaye said, well, wait a minute. The sages decreed or didn't decree in the case of one Jew living with a non-Jew, sharing a space with a non-Jew, because it was an unusual situation. But this isn't that situation. Here there's many Jews who are living in courtyards opening onto that alleyway. So even if we, nullify our rights in the alleyway to just the one guy, maybe this isn't the kind of situation that the sages withheld a decree from and permitted it. Maybe this doesn't apply to this situation. And Abaye said to them, the sages didn't decree for unusual situations. And it is also unusual that all of you nullify your rights just to one of you. Because the result of that is that one guy is going to be able to carry in the alleyway, but the rest of you will not. Right? You're all giving up your right to carry in the alleyway to just one of you. So, okay, one of you will be able to carry on Shabbos across the alleyway, The rest of you are only going to be able to carry within your own courtyards. That's unusual. And so it's okay to rely on a decree that was a non-decree only in unusual situations. Rava said, when he heard about this, he said, whoa. There's a big problem here. The problem here is that now you've created a situation where there's only one Jew who has right to carry in the alleyway that he shares with the non-Jew. In that situation, you don't need an eruv at all. That one person doesn't need an eruv, right? A person who just lives, let's say, one house in one courtyard, he doesn't share that courtyard with anyone else. He doesn't have to join in an eruv with anybody, so no eruv is necessary for carrying in the alleyway if only one Jew has a right to carry in that alleyway. And once you make an arrangement like this, people, will forget the laws of eruv, which we've already established is a value. That's why when we had a city that kind of grew, and we're going to make a city-wide eruv by joining all of the neighborhoods together, we're going to exclude one of those neighborhoods so that people will learn and remember the laws of eruv. And here you're going to obliterate that value, says Rava. So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, answers Rava and says, okay, you're saying an eruv won't be required because there's only one Jew who has the rights to use that alleyway, sharing it with one non-Jew. But you've also said that it's an important value that people learn and remember the laws of eruv. So we'll establish an eruv even though only one person is benefiting from it, and we'll let it be known that the reason we've established that eruv is so that the laws of eruv will not be forgotten. Rava says, yeah, well, that's not quite right because people will come to think that we can establish an eruv even when the non-Jew doesn't cooperate, which is the original situation that we're trying to make a workaround since he won't cooperate. So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, says, no, okay, I understand what you're saying. So what we'll do is we'll announce to the community that this eruv is not effective as an eruv. We're not making an eruv without the cooperation of the non-Jew who has rights in that alleyway. It's actually a symbolic eruv that we're making just so that the laws of eruv won't be forgotten and everyone will know what we're doing. Rava says, will the children of the residents who live here now hear your announcement? Will the grandchildren hear your announcement? They won't know that you made this arrangement and why you made it. They're just going to know that an eruv was made and only one person can use it and the non-Jew didn't cooperate, but they didn't know. It's too confusing, too many conditions that are not going to be well known. Doesn't work. Rather, you have to go by a whole other plan. Whole other solution. Says Rava, what should happen here is that one of you needs to get friendly with the non-Jew. Now, you'd think that if they could have arranged that to begin with, the non-Jew would have agreed to take a penny to give away some symbolic rights so that people could carry in the alleyway on Shabbos. But okay, for whatever reason, he doesn't want to rent out his rights. He doesn't want to enter into some kind of agreement that even sounds like a legal or formal agreement with the neighboring Jews. Okay, so just get friendly with him. One of you get friendly with him and arrange with him that you can leave something, some object, like a utensil on his property. So for example, a rake or a shovel, right? And you're just going to arrange with him, is it okay if I just leave this rake in this corner of your yard? Is it okay? Right? And once he agrees to that, then legally speaking, since you're keeping a tool or equipment on his property, you're going to acquire the legal status of his hired laborer or harvester, right? That you're his employee. Once you're storing your equipment in his property, it's like you're his employee. And we have a ruling from Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, who says that for the purposes of an eruv, you can make an arrangement with the hired laborer or harvester of a non-Jew. right? So he can actually, once he becomes the guy's employee, he can make this symbolic arrangement with you. It's not going to affect him in any way. That's why they're permitting this. If it was somehow going to impinge on the rights, the guy knows that you're storing the shovel there. That he consciously permitted. But the fact that the guy whose shovel is resting in his yard then makes an arrangement with the rest of the Jews who live around this alleyway and says, okay, now this property is also included in the eruv. Boom, everybody can carry in the alleyway on Shabbos. You can make use of this ruling of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel that the laborer of the non-Jew can make a contribution to the eruv and permit everyone else to carry. It's as if that property, that homeowner is now involved in the eruv, right? And so it's a beautiful leniency that you guys can make use of. Abaye said to Rav Yosef when he heard about this recommendation of Rava, he said, "Oh well, what if the non-Jew actually has 5 Jews working for him? He actually has Jews as laborers, and do we have to get that agreement to participate in the eruv from all 5 of his hired laborers?" And Rav Yosef said, this whole concept is a leniency just so that you can make an eruv in difficult and awkward situations. We're not giving that ruling. Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel didn't give that ruling so that it should become a stringency. No, you don't have to get all 5 of his hired laborers to agree. If just one of them will agree to the eruv, you're all set. The eruv is going to work. Okay, now we're going to hinge off this discussion about eruv, and we're going to go into this very interesting area about some of the sages' attitudes with regard to drinking wine and what one may or may not do under the effects of wine. How do we get there? So Rav Nachman comments about this ruling, this leniency that Rav Yehuda shared in the name of Shmuel, that the hired laborer or harvester of the non-Jew in the neighborhood can sort of join in on his behalf in the eruv to make the eruv work for everybody who lives in the neighborhood. And so about that leniency, Rav Nachman comments, how excellent is this ruling? A little bit like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. He says, how excellent is this ruling? However, with respect to another ruling of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, it's not so excellent, right? So Rav Nachman is simply commenting on rulings made, shared by Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. So he likes Shmuel's ruling about this leniency with respect to eruv. But Shmuel also said, and Rav Yehuda shared in his name, that one who drinks a revi'is of wine, like a quarter log of wine. A revi'is is a fourth, and it's a fourth of what? Of a log. How much is this? Basically, it's a measure of wine that's equal to a little less than 4 ounces of wine. Now, unclear if that means diluted wine or straight wine, because in ancient times, like when they just talked about wine before it was mixed in a cup, it would be about 4 times stronger than the wine that we're accustomed to drinking today. So it's a little unclear here if he's talking about, 4 ounces of wine or the equivalent of 16 ounces of the kind of wine that we're used to. A little bit unclear. But since it's being drunk, let's just assume that it's like the kind of wine that we're used to, just for the sake of argument. So it's basically a glass of wine, right? Basically a glass of wine. So Shmuel says, somebody who drinks a glass of wine should not make halachic rulings, right? In other words, a scholar, a sage, who is going to be, presented questions of Torah law, should not issue a ruling if he's had a glass of wine, says Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. Rav Nachman says, no, that ruling is not excellent. Why is that ruling not excellent? Because, says Rav Nachman, until I drink a revi'is of wine, my head is not clear. And so for Rav Nachman, he just has a glass of wine to relax and settle into the job of judging. That's why I think it's fairer to assume that he's just having one glass of wine. He's not having 4 glasses of wine before he sits to judge and hear cases and issue rulings of Torah law. Okay, so, Shmuel is like, zero tolerance policy. You drink wine, you don't issue rulings. Rav Nachman says, I can hold my wine, and not only that, it kind of settles me into the judging mood, as it were, and then I'm ready to judge, says Rav Nachman. But Rava says to Rav Nachman, in the name of Rabbi Acha Bar Chanina, one who says this teaching is pleasant and that teaching is not pleasant, he will lose the fortune of Torah. Right? Rav is not objecting to the fact that Rav Nachman likes to drink a glass of wine before he sits to judge. Rava is objecting to Rav Nachman's comment, kind of offhand comment that, well, some of the teachings of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel are excellent, and some of the teachings of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel are not excellent. That kind of commentary Rava disapproves of. He disapproves of it in the name of Rabbi Acha Bar Chanina, and that one can even come to lose his wisdom if he's going to, make those kinds of, randomly almost complimentary or disparaging remarks. It's not that Rav Nachman says, well, he holds that one may drink a glass of wine, and he holds that one may not drink a glass of wine and judge, and I hold that one may drink a glass of wine and judge. That's different. That's a judge issuing a different ruling based on his understanding of the law. What Rava was objecting to is Rav Nachman just making remarks about other people's rulings. It's kind of interesting. I don't know if any of you saw some of the hearings today about the prospective Supreme Court justice, but this idea, she often said, I don't make remarks about the judgments of my colleagues, right? And that seems to be a principle in American jurisprudence. And we see here, there's a precedent for it that Rava sort of called Rav Nachman on this making remarks about other people's rulings. And Rav Nachman, to his great credit, said, I was not aware of that teaching, and I retract my remarks, and I will not make remarks like it in the future. Right, so that's one of the great things about the sages is even though they have big egos, they're very passionate about what their search for truth. They'll argue, like crazy with each other when they feel that the truth is on their side. But when they're called out on something and they realize they were wrong, they're quick to admit it. And that's a good lesson for all of us. Okay, so Rabba bar Rav Huna says regarding drinking and praying, one who drinks should not pray, but his prayer is valid. Meaning if you've had a drink, you shouldn't pray. Zero tolerance. If you've had a drink, you shouldn't pray. But if you do pray, your prayer is valid. One who is intoxicated is different than one who's had a drink. So says Rabba bar Rav Huna, one who is intoxicated, his prayer is an abomination. So it's very interesting. Now you may see, especially in very frum, very religious Jewish communities, there's a lot of l'chaims that go on Shabbos, right? Or on Friday night dinners. There's definitely is some drinking that's part of the tradition at times, and people get happy. But they do that by the dinner. They do that after the praying is done. Right? And you may address remarks to God and talk to God and praise God and sing to God, even if you've had a few drinks. But what they're saying is when we say pray, to pray, the prayer, as we learned in the first tractate of the Talmud, that's a specific thing. When the sages talk about praying, they're talking about saying the prayer. What is the prayer? The Shmona Esrei, also known as the Amidah. The basic prayer that Jews say that Jewish man is obligated to say 3 times a day. It's called Shmona Esrei, the 18 blessings. So to say the 18 blessings, and there's a morning Amidah, an afternoon Amidah, and an evening Amidah. And Amidah means standing. It's a prayer that you must say standing. So it's 18 blessings that eventually became 19 blessings, and we must say them standing. And when you're engaged in that, the prayer, you shouldn't have any drinks before you say it. If you have one drink, okay, it's still your prayer is still valid. You fulfilled your obligation. But if you're intoxicated, you have not fulfilled your obligation, and you shouldn't step up and pray at all. Rather, you should wait until the effects of the alcohol wear off. And if you've missed the time for your prayer, then you do the next prayer service, and you have to add in the makeup Amidah. Like normally, like if you didn't pray in the morning, then by Mincha, the afternoon prayer service, you would add an extra Amidah. When do you do it? You say the Amidah, then you say some other thing like a psalm or the alleyway or some other little prayer. You recite another, small p prayer, and then you come back and do an extra Amidah to make up for the morning one that you missed. In this case, it's not because you forgot, it's because you realized you're intoxicated, you're not in a condition to make that Amidah, so you wait until the alcohol wears off, and then later you do a makeup Amidah. Okay. So then the question, of course, is, well, how many drinks equal intoxicated, right? They didn't have a breathalyzer like that, 0.10 blood alcohol level, you're too impaired to drive. Is that when you're too impaired to say the prayer? Obviously, they didn't have breathalyzers back then. They needed a measure that was just a little bit more, lyrical and logic-based rather than, chemical analysis-based. So what did the sages say? It makes so much sense when you hear it. What is too intoxicated to pray? A person is too intoxicated to pray if he can't, speak in an appropriate way in the presence of a king, right? So if you're too drunk, like if you had, if you were invited to meet the Queen of England, right? It says king, but whatever, the monarch. So if you were invited to meet the Queen of England, you'd probably be like, wow, what a big honor. It's incredible. You'd prepare for it. You'd learn all the etiquette. You'd dress up. You'd do all kinds of stuff. And, even though you're nervous, you wouldn't get drunk and then walk in and meet the Queen and say, oh, what's up, Your Highness, right? You would never do that. Likewise, when you step up to pray the prayer in front of the King of Kings, you would not drink any amount that would cause you to speak inappropriately, to slur your speech, to stumble, to seem drunk, right? So if you're gonna seem drunk to the king and or to yourself, okay, then you're too drunk to pray. If you're under control and you're just a little bit buzzed, okay, you shouldn't do it. But if you do make the prayer in that condition, you will have at least fulfilled your obligation. If you're slurring your speech and you pray, it's an abomination, says Rabba bar Rav Huna. Okay. And how do we know that? How do we know that being intoxicated means you can't handle yourself in the presence of a king? Very colorful little story where we learn that from. Rabbi Abba bar Shumni and Rav Menashe bar Yirmiyah of Gifty, from Gifty, Rabbi Rav Menashe bar Yirmiyah from Gifty. So these are two names you don't hear very often. But there was a little incident where the two of them were good friends, and they were standing by the Yofti River, and they had been hanging out together, and now they were going to part company. Maybe they've been traveling together for a while, and now they're going to part company. And so one of them says to the other, now it's time to take our leave from each other. Let's each share a bit of Torah with the other, ideally something you haven't heard before. And it's a beautiful way to say goodbye. This is a teaching of Mari bar Rav Huna, who said that's the way that you should say goodbye. When you're taking your leave from a friend, leave a little bit of Bible with them, right? Leave a little bit of Torah, a bissel of Torah, a teaching, right? Leave them with a Torah teaching, ideally one they haven't heard before. Why? Because then they'll remember you better and they'll associate you with the last thing you said to them, which was a word of Torah. And if it's one they never heard before, all the more they will associate you and your name and your presence and your friendship with that person with some Torah. What a lovely teaching. So the two of them said, yes, okay, let's do that. And one of them shared what is it to be what is the difference between drinking wine and being intoxicated from wine? You're intoxicated if you can't handle yourself in the presence of the king. And the other one shared that one who acquires the property of a convert, meaning somebody who converted to Judaism, when somebody becomes a Jew, this is especially in ancient Israel when the temple was standing, and somebody joined the Jewish people. So when they do that, they become a son or daughter of Abraham and Sarah. And then, they can purchase property in Israel. But when they die, if they don't have children after they become a Jew, right? If they don't have any relatives who are Jews, so then their property had to pass to a Jew. And sometimes it would happen that it was like the nearest person who happened to see that, this property became available ends up acquiring it. In other words, if you win the lottery. That's what they're really talking about here. If you win the lottery, and they give other examples, like if a man marries a very rich woman and comes into a bunch of property because she's rich, or if you find a lost article that, it just came to you because you got lucky. In any of these cases, and Rava says even if you just were simply successful in business, you made a deal and it was fabulously successful. In all these cases where you come into wealth that you didn't expect, what should you do? You should dedicate some of that wealth to Torah, right? And so if you come into a lot of wealth, you should have a Sefer Torah written. Now that's very expensive, right? If you commission a Torah scroll, a full-on Torah scroll to be written, that takes years of work by a scribe, and that costs, that can cost anywhere from $30,000 to $100,000 to commission a Torah scroll. But, if you come into millions, then you should have a Torah scroll written. Why? Because it will remind you that, you didn't come into that wealth because you're great. You came into that wealth because God arranged for you to have it. And this principle goes beyond somebody who comes into millions of dollars and commissions a Torah scroll. Anybody who's doing well should be thinking, I want to set aside some of the money that comes to me for the sake of heaven, either by giving it to charity, particularly so that people can eat or so that others can learn Torah, but also to beautify the mitzvah. If you buy nice things to do mitzvahs with, like you should have tefillin and you should have nice tefillin, or you want to, you cut the challah on Friday nights, you should have a nice board to cut the challah on. You make kiddush in a kiddush cup, you should have a nice kiddush cup. When you spend money on doing mitzvahs, on charity, on supporting the work of heaven, you're acknowledging that whatever you have, all that comes your way is really from the hand of heaven. Even if you earned it with hard work, the opportunity to earn it came to you from heaven. And, if you've been with me for a while, you've often heard me say, it's imperative. It's an imperative. You must set aside a portion of your income as a tithe for good causes, right? Give to nonprofits, give to people who teach Torah, give to people who feed the poor, give to people who shelter and clothe the poor, give to good causes. Choose the cause yourself. You should have causes that you support, that you care about, but you should be setting aside a portion, a steady portion of all your income. So for us, we put 10% of everything that we make, net income, everything that comes into our bank account, immediately we put 10% into the special charity account. And then there's always money in that charity account as long as we're making money. And then it's our job to distribute the funds from the charity account. And, what can I say? Nina and I feel like as long as we've been doing that, it's like we've been blessed even more. We feel very blessed, right? And we're not rich people, that's for sure. But we can live, and by knowing that 10% of whatever we make is automatically going, to the work of heaven, for the sake of heaven, we feel like more comes our way, and God is our partner, and things go better. I highly recommend to everybody, just make the decision. 10% of everything that comes in goes right out to the causes that you support. If you're not ready to give it out today, just hold it in a bank account. But all money in that bank account, the charity account, is for the purpose of giving away to good causes. And here we have that teaching right here. Finally, we're going to have one more little incident from which we're going to learn a few lessons. And in this incident, the reason it's being related here is because this is also going to touch on drinking and judging. And if somebody has drunk some alcohol and feels that he shouldn't judge, well, therefore, how long should he wait? So that's why this next story is being told, but it has a few extra wrinkles. Colorful little story. I'm going to go through it, and then I'm going to get to your questions and comments. So if you have some, put them in there now. Okay. So we learned that Rabban Gamliel. So Rabban Gamliel was the Nasi. He was the head of the whole Torah community in the Holy Land. Rabban Gamliel was riding a donkey, and his assistant, Rabbi Eli, was walking beside him, right? So Rabban Gamliel is a very prominent person, so he was riding the donkey. Rabbi Eli was walking next to him as his assistant, and they were going from Akko to Ketziv. So this is along the coast, right? The Mediterranean coast of the Holy Land. And while they're going up the road, Rabban Gamliel, he's on the donkey. He can look around better, see a little more. And he spots some very fine loaves of bread sitting on the road. So he says to his assistant, Rabbi Eli, pick up those loaves of bread. Rabbi Eli picks them up. He carries them. They go walk a little farther. And then they encounter a goy, a non-Jew. And they greet him and they're friendly. And then Rabban Gamliel says to Rabbi Eli, give our new friend here the loaves of bread. Give them to him. And from this, we learn a few lessons. Number one, if you see food, you pick it up. Food should not go to waste. And this is a general principle. We are careful about food. We are careful about food. We're thankful for every bit of food that comes across our table, that enters our refrigerator, that enters our cupboard. Again, any food that we have, even though we bought it with the money that we earned by working, etc., still, really, it comes to us from heaven, and we're careful with it, and we're not wasteful, right? Somebody who, sort of is negligent about food, God forbid, one day that, food won't be so abundant for them. So we want to be careful about food, and if we see food lying in the street that is, good edible food, it would be better if we could find a home for that food. Somebody should get it. Second, Rabban Gamliel knew that this road, some Jews travel on it, but more non-Jews travel on it. So, and also because it was shortly after Passover. And so the Jews who can't eat bread during Passover, it's not longer Passover, but Passover just ended. That's part of the story we get later. And so he figures, okay, these loaves clearly belong to a non-Jew. So we don't know, he probably despaired of finding them. We can't give it back to the owner. We don't know where the actual owner is. But if we're going to give it to somebody, let's give it to a non-Jew, because it was probably a non-Jew who lost it. And we are allowed, and the third lesson is we can benefit from bread even though it's shortly after Passover, right? How does he benefit? He's just giving it to this fellow. How does Rabban Gamliel benefit from that? And we have a teaching that when you give someone a gift, you get benefit from giving a gift, right? Because he's grateful. It's a nice exchange. He's happy with you. You're more friendly. You're on better terms now. And so we consider that whenever you give somebody a gift, you get a benefit from being the one who gives that gift. Obviously, he gets benefit from receiving the gift, but you get benefit from giving a gift. That's a good lesson to remember right there. Why is this story being told with respect to wine? That was just the preliminary. So Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Eli arrive at their destination, the town of Ketziv. And when they get there, a Jew comes running up. It's the great prominent Rabban Gamliel. And he asks Rabban Gamliel to annul a vow for him, right? So a little bit of background on that. When we take a vow, when we say, I vow before God that I'm going to, do such and such, or very often I vow that I will not do such and such. I won't benefit from that person. I won't eat bread, or I won't drink wine, or I won't eat today. Things like that. It's no one obligated you to take a vow. But once you take a vow, you're obligated in the vow. And if you break your vow that you made before God, that's a sin. So it happened quite often that people made a vow and then they regretted making the vow because they didn't realize, how onerous it would be to fulfill that vow. So then they want to annul the vow. But you can't annul your own vow. You have to go to a sage, a competent halakhic authority, a Torah authority, and ask him to annul your vow for you. So here comes Rabban Gamliel. The guy comes running up and says, I made a vow. Can you annul it for me? So Rabban Gamliel says to his assistant, Rabbi Abaye, did we drink a revi'is of that Italian wine? And Rabbi Abaye says, yeah, we did. We each drank a revi'is. So Rabban Gamliel says, I can't sit as a judge right now and annul your vow. Why don't you walk with us? And I'm just going to, walk off the effects of the wine. And then once the effect has been dispelled, then I'll be happy to sit with you and see if we can annul your vow. So Rabban Gamliel kept riding his donkey and past this town of Ketziv, and they're coming toward another town, which is the ladder of Tyre. It's a place. Tyre is another city up the coast from Ketziv. And so how far did he walk? 3 mil. A mil is about a kilometer, right? So and he ends up going about 2 more miles. And at that point, he feels like the wine has worn off, and now he's ready to judge. Earlier, we had a teaching that said, in order to walk off you can walk off the effects of wine, you only have to walk about 1 kilometer. But Rabban Gamliel was not walking. He was riding a donkey. So if you're riding a donkey, it takes more time for the wine to wear off. We also had a teaching from, was it Rav Nachman? Rav Nachman was bringing it down, saying that the idea was how do we dispel the effects of wine? And some say, walk it off, walk like a kilometer, or take a nap and then it'll go away. But then this other person said, Rav Nachman said that Rabba Bar Avu said that walking it off or taking a nap only works if you had a small amount of wine. But if you had a lot of wine, don't try to walk it off. That's just going to confuse you more. Don't try to sleep it off. That's just going to confuse you and make you more intoxicated. Just rest and do nothing, and eventually it'll wear off. But so here, they hadn't drunk that much wine. He might have been able to walk it off, but he wasn't walking. He was riding the donkey, so he required extra time. So what do we learn from this? First of all, that if you're riding the donkey, for the wine to wear off, it takes longer than just walking, 3 times as long. Once he got that distance and he felt he was ready, he got off the donkey, he sat down, he wrapped his shawl around him, meaning his prayer shawl, his talis, so that he would have the awe of heaven upon him. That's why he wrapped himself in the prayer shawl. And then he was ready to hear the man's story, and then he helped him annul the vow. And so from those things we learn that when somebody is going to judge, right, he certainly holds by that ruling of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, that if you've drunk anything, you shouldn't judge. That you shouldn't judge while you're mounted on a donkey or standing or walking. You should only be sitting with your shawl on and no effects of wine on you. That's when you're ready to judge, according to Rabban Gamliel. And that's what I've got for us today. All right. There's also a little bit more discussion about how we annul vows. Just super briefly, because it's a bigger topic, but super briefly, basically the way that a sage annuls a vow for you is he asks you, if you had known what was going to be involved in fulfilling that vow and how onerous it was going to be, would you have taken the vow? And if a person says no, then he says, okay, so then that is the opening to annul your vow. If the person says, I just wish I hadn't made a vow because it's bad to make vows, and I learned that it's bad to make vows, that's not enough of a reason to cancel the vow. We annul vows when the person realized that if they'd known what was going to be involved in fulfilling the vow, they never would have undertaken the vow in the first place. All right, let's check comments and questions. Bill Eldridge. So, would this symbolic rent, so we're going back to the case of the non-Jew in the neighborhood who restricts his Jewish neighbors from carrying in a joint area on Shabbos, would this symbolic rent for the non-Jewish neighbor be similar to the concept of the peppercorn rent in the common law? A question I only feel is fair to ask because I recall that Sal went to law school. I did go to law school. I don't know what the peppercorn law is in the common law. I'm going to assume that you're talking about it's essentially a symbolic transfer. And it is similar, and we have this concept all over Jewish law, actually. Once we get into the middle of our Talmud journey, into the sort of commercial tractates, and Bava Kama and Bava Metzia, and so the law of contracts, one thing that we'll see is that, if you sell land to somebody, or you sell a horse to somebody, or, you buy a load of grain, something, right? So very often they wouldn't sit there and write out a contract. Even today, people buy and sell all the time without necessarily entering into a written contract. And so what was necessary is a kinyan, an act of acquisition. Sometimes the act of acquisition, like if you're selling a horse, like the sale of the horse isn't completed until the person who's buying the horse takes the bridle of the horse and draws it to him. Sometimes the act of acquisition is as simple as picking up a handkerchief, right? But it's like, I put that handkerchief there and you pick it up. And that's visible to witnesses of the deal. So that's really what's going on there. There has to be some arrangement made that isn't just a conversation in passing. Something has to be exchanged so that something was exchanged, so that the arrangement has more substance and is more memorialized, as it were. Nina has a question. If you're not supposed to pray after you've had a drink, how do you justify Kiddush Club? So Kiddush clubs, in some synagogues on Saturday morning, some of the people, who prayer isn't such a thing for them, they go outside and have a drink. I've got to guess. I'm not really into Kiddush Club. I like to stay in there and pray. I'm not judging anybody. But I think what they're making use of is this difference between drinking and being intoxicated. If you've only had a drink, technically one ought not pray. But if he does pray, he's fulfilled his obligation. So I think the people who go to Kiddush Club, really what they're there for is the conversation, and they might have a l'chaim, but they're not getting tipsy or even buzzed. So it's appropriate for them to come back in and say the Musaf Amida, right? Usually it's Kiddush Club, happens during the Torah reading. I don't know. I don't really go to Kiddush Club. But I know it's during the morning services on Saturday that guys do that who want to do that. And really, they're just sitting there chatting with each other, having a l'chaim, but they're not getting drunk, Where a little bit more drinking goes on is over the Shabbos lunch after the morning service. And then they're going to have enough time in the afternoon before they go to the afternoon prayer for the effects of that alcohol to wear away. That's my understanding. Regarding not being intoxicated in the presence of a king, Arnold Albin asks, or comments, by the same token, one should not be so intoxicated so as not to be able to address one's wife, i.e., your queen. What a beautiful teaching. What a beautiful teaching. There's drinking that goes on in terms, and often on our show when we have guests here, we'll make a l'chaim and then we'll share some Torah. And really, the purpose of the l'chaim is, it's to drink, it's to life, right? L'chaim means to life. It allows us to make a blessing, right? That's almost one of the main purposes that we make a l'chaim. We say a blessing because when we drink something, we make a blessing. We thank God for the thing we're about to drink that was created by God's word. And if we're going to make a blessing, we should make a blessing over something good, so it should be a quality liquid that we're drinking. And so it's nice to say it over some high quality booze. But people aren't really, getting intoxicated. It's more like a nice spirit, a nice spirit for a spiritual purpose. The only time that people are intoxicated is at Purim, where it's actually commanded to get somewhat intoxicated. And some say it's Simchas Torah. Really, at Purim is where one is commanded to get intoxicated. So maybe 2 days out of 365. The rest of the time, the tradition really looks down on getting intoxicated. It's not appropriate. Yosef Shum. The Daily Daf on My Jewish Learning says that Rashi comments that the verse the sages quote is a paraphrase from Ben Sira, the quote concerning not praying angry or drunk, right? One should not be angry in his prayer or drunk. So thank you for sharing that with us. Wasn't familiar with that one. So that's what I've got for us today. What is the fruit of our learning today? Everything in moderation. We can make a l'chaim. It's nice. Some people even feel that it clears their head. But anything beyond that, right? We shouldn't drink at all before praying. We shouldn't drink at all before judging. Some people feel like they can. It's not going to impair them. But if they're impaired, then praying or by extension judging would be an abomination. So certainly the rabbis are against drinking and praying, and they're against drinking and judging. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a fine, fine evening.